Welcome and thank you for joining us for this talk, Japanese Americans, Hibakusha, and Nuclear Weapons, Linking Past and Present. I'm Catherine Crockett, President of Monterey Peace and Justice Center. And this series is a project of Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, Monterey County Branch. This is the first in the series of Saturday events in August to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombing that occurred August 6th and 9th in 1945. I'm honored to welcome our three speakers tonight. The program will be presented in three parts with a brief Q&A after each segment. Larry Oda, our first speaker, will discuss Japanese immigrants, Japanese Americans and the World War II experience. Mr. Oda was born in a Justice Department internment camp in Crystal City, Texas during World War II. He lives in Monterey, California. He was educated in Monterey City schools and earned his bachelor's and master's degrees in California State University, Fresno. Larry is a past president of the Japanese American Citizens League. He has served on the National Board of the Buddhist Churches of America as a delegate at large and president of the Coast District Council. He's currently a trustee of the Big Sur Land Trust. After 27 years with the city of Salinas, Larry retired as the maintenance superintendent and administrative hearing officer. His interests include U.S.-Japan relations, auto restorations, and golf. Arlington, Arly, Mica, our second speaker, will discuss Hibakusha, the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the current status of the Hibakusha. Mr. Mica was born in San Francisco, California. His father was in the U.S. Army and his mother was a Hibakusha from Nagasaki, Japan. By the time he was 10 years old, his family had lived in California, Texas, Alaska, Colorado, and then back to California. He graduated from Carmel High School and then from the University of San Francisco, where he received his bachelor's degree in government with an emphasis in Asian studies. He was commissioned in the U.S. Air Force Reserve through the Air Force ROTC program, where he served for 2 years and then spent 18 years in the U.S. Navy Reserves as an intelligence officer, retiring in October 2005 as a lieutenant commander. He has been employed with the federal government for 27 years and has been in his field for 35 years. And lastly, our third speaker, Dr. Yamada, he'll discuss nuclear non-proliferation and war no more. David Yamada lived in Pasadena, California, prior to his family's forced removal to the Gila, Arizona concentration camp in World War II. He earned his BA and MA degrees in political science at UC Berkeley and received his PhD in political science at UC Santa Barbara. He's professor emeritus of Monterey Peninsula College Political Science Department, where he taught from 1971 to 1998. He was a Fulbright visiting professor at Hiroshima University in Japan, 1986-1987. And he was a senior policy director for the Panetta Institute for Public Policy, 2000 to 2003. He served as an adjunct professor at Monterey Institute of International Studies from 1979 to 1996, and at California State University at Monterey Bay, 1990 to 1993, where he was awarded the Distinguished Fellow in Education in 1999. In 1995, he published the award, he published the Japanese of Monterey Peninsula, their history and legacy between 1895 and 1995. And this was in collaboration with the Japanese American Citizens League of Monterey Peninsula. He lives in Monterey County with his wife, Catherine. And now I'm going to turn it over to Larry Otis, who will begin our first segment.
Very good. Thank you very much, Catherine. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Larry Oda, and I am happy to join you this evening to give you a short history of Japanese in America, primarily about the area, the Japanese in the area. So I would like to briefly go over a timeline of events and laws that were passed to limit Asian participation in American society. The first immigration law that in 1790 stated that any free white man who lived in the United States for 2 years could become a citizen. In 1870, this law was amended to include those of African descent. And this particular law was interpreted to exclude Asians from becoming naturalized citizens. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, banning Chinese from entering the country and denied Chinese immigrants the path to citizenship using the 1870 amended law. In 1886, the first event that we're considering is the first immigrants from Japan began to arrive in Hawaii and California to work in the sugarcane fields. And they came to Santa Cruz to clear land. In 1905, this is one of the significant events, I think. Japan defeated the Russian fleet in this in the Battle of Tsushima to maintain control over Southeast Asia. In 1907, another law that was passed, the Gentleman's Agreement, limiting Japanese immigration. Also in 1907, just for interest, the Expatriation Act forced women who married foreigners to lose their US citizenship. In 1913, the alien land laws were enacted that prevented immigrant Japanese from owning land. The wording was aliens ineligible for citizenship could not own land. In 1924, the National Origin Act ended Japanese immigration. Then in 1941, the US declared war on Japan following a military attack on Pearl Harbor. In 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing the removal and incarceration of 120,000 persons of Japanese ancestry in US concentration camps. In 1945, the war with Japan ends after the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In 1952, the McCarran-Walter Act granted the right of naturalization to Japanese. In 1988, the President Ronald Reagan signed into law the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, apologizing and offering redress and reparations to Japanese Americans who were denied their constitutional rights by the US government during World War II. Japan was completely isolated from the outside world from 1638 to 1854. Subsequently, under the Meiji Restoration, the Japanese were allowed to emigrate starting in 1886, as I had mentioned. This picture was taken in 1900 near 5th and Junipero in Carmel. The men were clearing land for the city of Carmel to build their roads. The person second from the right is Kumahiro Miyamoto, a pioneer family in Carmel Valley. After he made some money, he started farming. One of the industries that supported our immigrant fathers was fishing. You can change, yes. And then the next one, the first commercial abalone fishery was started in Point Lobos around 1894. First with free diving, then with helmet supplied air diving suits as shown in the picture. Initially, they used hand powered pumps, and the pumps were only allowed to be operated by relatives of the diver with the thought that they wouldn't let their relative run out of air. By 1920, about 80% of the fishing boats in Monterey Bay were Japanese. Excuse me. And as time went on, the boats got bigger. This picture is of Frank Manaka's boat with a deck full of sardines. To complement fishing, there were fish markets, and processing plants and fish canneries. The photo showing the Higashi Fish Company is, I think we're going to have a descendant of Mr. Higashi on one of our programs later in the month, Jerry Takigawa. And the next slide is one of the Japanese-owned fish canneries. And I'll just mention that the the open ocean exhibit of the Monterey Big Aquarium is where this cannery was located. During the 20s and 30s, the Japanese farmer continued to develop their niche in the region to agriculture. With the help of Japanese agriculturalists, new crops were developed, first with strawberries in the Pajaro Valley, then lettuce, broccoli, and celery in the Salinas Valley. By the 1930s, the Salinas Valley became known as a salad bowl of the world. By 1940, over half the strawberries, celery, snap peas, peppers, cauliflower, and spinach grown in California was grown by Japanese farmers. You can advance the slide, Catherine. And once more. Once more. The agriculture was a primary area of employment for the Japanese up to the beginning of World War II. Though Japanese farmed a small percentage of farms in 1940, and their farms tended to be smaller than most, they still wielded considerable economic clout because they were excellent farmers and produced a high volume of crop per acre. This is Suehiro Miyamoto on his ranch at the mouth of Carmel Valley. And toward the left is now the area that's occupied by the barnyard and the what used to be Britain's Hardware. You can see the hills behind it where I guess Highway 1 would be at the bottom of the hills. The residents enjoyed the pleasures of the peninsula, like picnics at Point Lobos, and baseball was a favorite sports activity for the young men. Teams from the neighboring communities would play each other. So this picture shows a tournament from Watsonville in 1923, and the tournament was between Monterey, Watsonville, and Salinas, and you can advance a slide, Catherine. The Monterey was pretty good. I think even back then, I'd mentioned Suehiro Miyamoto and Kumahiro Miyamoto. Their sons were excellent athletes in the 30s and 40s. This picture was taken in 1923. And I mentioned that Monterey must have been pretty good because you see the M on the uniforms and the team on the left, and they're holding the trophy. The interesting part about this particular picture is the person standing behind the person with the trophy to his left is my dad. So my personal attachment to this photo. So December 7th, 1941 changed everything for the Japanese Americans. The underlying fear, prejudice, and jealousy that haunted the new immigrants reached a head with the attack on Pearl Harbor. It gave an excuse to suspend the civil rights of a whole group of people in the name of military necessity. The first step in incarcerating the population of Japanese Americans was to gather them in temporary assembly centers like the rodeo grounds in Salinas. This is the north end of the Salinas rodeo grounds. You can see the far turn of the racetrack in this picture. The inmates were housed in hastily constructed barracks where there was not enough space for all of the immigrants or inmates, I guess, so some were relegated to horse stalls. All their belongings, property, homes, stores, boats, farms had to be quickly sold or abandoned. Many of the neighbors took advantage of the situation and paid pennies on the dollar, or waited until after the premises were vacated and appropriated what was left. The estimated loss was about, in 1940 dollars, was $3 billion. And if you equate that to 2020 dollars, it'd be about $60 billion. In Monterey County, there were 2 packing houses that bought up the foreclosed properties that the Japanese could no longer afford to keep up. Interestingly, after the war, one of the packing houses sold the property back to the returning Japanese for what he had in them. And maybe not so interesting was that the other packing house did no such thing. When more permanent facilities were completed in the desolate interior of the country, the inmates were transported by train and bus to one of 10 war relocation incarceration facilities. The map that will come up shows the location of the sites associated with the incarceration of Japanese Americans in World War II. The may be hard to see, but there are 10 War Relocation Authority camps and about 17 other smaller Justice Department and military incarceration centers. I happen to be born in Crystal City, Texas, which is in the southern part of the state of Texas. And the next picture shows the entrance to the Manzanar Relocation Center, which is about 230 miles north of Los Angeles. Despite the families losing their livelihood and property, about 6,000 men and women volunteered for the military intelligence service to act as Japanese linguists and interpreters in the Pacific. They took part in every major battle and led General Douglas MacArthur to state that never in military history did an army know so much about the enemy prior to engagement than the Allies in the Pacific War. And his chief of intelligence, General Charles Willoughby, claimed that the Nisei linguists shortened the war by 2 years and saved countless American lives. The other unit that fought in Europe was the 100th 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Approximately 13,000 men served in this all segregated unit, which today remains the most decorated unit in the history of the military. This unit earned over 18,000 individual awards, including 21 Congressional Medals of Honor, 588 Silver Stars, 5,200 Bronze Stars, and an amazing 9,400 Purple Hearts. In October 2010, the Congressional Gold Medal was awarded to the 100th 442nd and the Military Intelligence Service for their World War II service. And in presenting this award, an award, not the Congressional Gold Medal, but in 1946, when the 442nd returned from Europe, they were reviewed by the president on the grounds of the White House. This was a unique event that didn't happen very often. But he addressed the unit and stated, "You fought not only the enemy, but you fought prejudice, and you won. Keep up that fight, and we will continue to win to make this great republic stand for what the Constitution says it stands for." In 1988, about 1970, there was a growing sentiment within the Japanese American community to hold the government accountable for the wrongful incarceration of the community during World War II. The effort culminated in a law apologizing, making restitution, and establishing a trust fund to educate the American public so such an egregious suspension of civil rights never happens again. And those who forget history are doomed to repeat it, as has been stated by a number of philosophers. And the events of the last couple of years kind of bear this out. So that's the end of my portion. And I guess we're opening it up to questions now, if you'd like. But thank you for your attention, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the program.
Okay, thank you, Larry. A couple of questions here. So talk about the Issei and the Nisei, the grandchildren of the Issei were the first generation Japanese in the United
Yes.
States. You could talk about their impact.
The Issei, I think that the immigration from Japan started as a result of some economic turmoil in Japan, and they were looking for a better life. Heard about the streets paved with gold in the United States, so they came to seek their fortune and worked hard, and were met with a considerable amount of discrimination. I think that there was a lot of jealousy because of, many of the immigrants came from initially from Hiroshima and Kumamoto, very productive farming regions in Japan. So they brought some very good skills with them, and they were able to farm marginal land. But as I mentioned in my comments, that they were very productive. Although they had smaller farms, they were able to produce, an abundance of crops. The Nisei, the second generation, the Japanese who were born in the U.S. Were American citizens, and they were also subject to this discrimination. Although they were American citizens, they were, I said it, were at a disadvantage because there were many laws that were passed to limit their participation in society. The parents couldn't own land, so there's always a workaround. You can the Issei parents would put the names of the property in the names of their American citizens, sons and daughters. But despite these hardships, they worked hard, and they succeeded. They were trying to be good Americans, and when World War II came along, this was maybe 50 years. Some of them had been here for 40 or 50 years and made a living, and all of that was taken away. And by that time, if you've been maybe 50 or 60 years old, when you have everything taken away, it's very difficult to start over again. Fishermen, the fishing captains who paid or were paying, I think the boats may have been $20,000 or $30,000, and we've seen letters where the boats were sold for $200, and that's a huge hit. When they came back, they were quite old, and a fishing boat captain found it hard to go back and work for someone else and be a deckhand. Mm-hmm. So even the Nisei men found that in this local area that gardening was an occupation that they could start and become, earn a living to pay for the food that they needed.
Mm.
So anyway, yeah, that's
Okay.
So
Thank you.
yes, no, thank
Thank you.
you.
And just one more before we move on to Arly Lamica's talk segment. How have the Coram Nobis cases led to justice for Japanese Americans?
We're going to have a program on August 15th, and the Coram Nobis cases, and I don't want to dominate this this part of the conversation, but I'm sure David has a number of comments, but the Coram Nobis case I guess was an obscure law that if there are errors in the trial that you can reopen. And what happened in the Coram Nobis cases was that Peter Irons and Eiko Herzog Yoshinaga discovered some documents in the archives that showed that the government withheld information at the trials of Hirabayashi, Yasui, and Korematsu. Those are referred to as the Coram Nobis cases. And so they reopened the cases, and I think that Korematsu was the first one, and the judge looked at it and saw that the government withheld information and vacated the conviction. And similar things happened with Min Yasui and Gordon Hirabayashi. Those the three, and maybe Mitsuye Ando. David, was she involved in those cases? Anyway,
no,
that's that's the Coram Nobis cases, where it's kind of funny that what happened was that there was a report given or printed up to give to the Supreme Court, and someone looked at it. I forget who the names were, but they looked at it and said, we can't say that we studied this and found that there were no evidence of sabotage. No one's been accused of treason, but they eliminated that from the report, and there were 10 copies of that report, and they were ordered destroyed. So the government is so efficient that they destroyed 9 copies. They kept one and put the note on that these are this is the document that was destroyed. So there was one original document that existed, and that's what Peter Irons and Eiko Yoshinaga discovered. And with that, they took that to reopen the cases, and interesting story. So otherwise, they didn't really have any evidence. So that's the Coram Nobis cases.
Thank you, Larry. And I hope that the guests will join our August 15th talk. That goes into more detail about that, about Executive Order 9066 and the lies by our government. So, well, thank you for your presentation, and we'll move on to Arlington, Mica.
Excuse me. I wonder if I could interject with just one brief story to share with our audience. Larry is absolutely right about the Coram Nobis cases. The story I have, what we're trying to do this evening is link Japanese immigrants to Arly's segment on the Hibakusha. And it occurs to me that freedom liberty is the absence of coercion. Yet in both cases, we will see that extreme coercion was used against Japanese Americans. And in that light, discrimination is something I want to share a brief story with you. Larry mentioned the 1907 Expatriation Act. And what that did again was say that if an American woman married an alien immigrant, that American woman would lose her citizenship. There was a young lady born in America by the name of Hinako. And she was born in 1908 in Los Angeles, California. So based on the 14th Amendment, she is entitled to American citizenship. There was a young immigrant from Japan by the name of Gakuro. Gakuro came here from southwestern Japan, Hiroshima Ken, in 1923, 1 year before the Immigration Act that Larry mentioned. They got married in 1930. So you have an alien immigrant marrying an American citizen by virtue of the 14th Amendment. The woman lost her citizenship by doing so, and that woman, Hinako, was my mother. And the immigrant from Japan, Hiroshima, was my father. So were there discriminatory laws? Yes, to the extent that citizenship by virtue of birth in this country was deprived.
David, we share a similar story.
Mhm.
My mother was born in Watsonville, California. And when she married, my dad, who was an immigrant, she lost her citizenship. And, I still have her, she was naturalized in 1953. And I still have her, they give you the Declaration of Independence as a copy of it, in your naturalization ceremony. And I still have that hanging in my house. She was very proud of that. She was, although she was born in Watsonville, she had to regain her citizenship by becoming naturalized.
I would quickly interject that it was Congress that passed the Cable Act of 1922 that stipulated if a person is married, an American citizen female, is married to an alien, quote, ineligible to citizenship, the woman loses her citizenship.
Right. So we did.
Okay,
We share that story.
I think Arly's up.
Okay, before Arly begins, I just want to mention, I want to warn you that some of the images are graphic and disturbing, but I want to share a quote. This is from a 1957 Life magazine article where photo images of the bombing were first shown. And the quote is, "The love of peace has no meaning or no stamina unless it is based on the knowledge of war's terrors." So with that, we'll begin Arly's segment. Please prompt me, Arly, when
Yes, I will.
All right.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us for this event today, or I should say tonight. This really has a special meaning to me because, as my bio said, that my mother was a Hibakusha survivor of the Nagasaki bombing. And if you go ahead, and what I'm going to do is tell a little history, and then the what the survivors has gone through, and also that it wasn't just Japanese survivors, because in Nagasaki there were POW camps that had Allied soldiers in, and they were affected as well. So if we go to the first slide, please. Yeah, I don't see it on my screen.
Oh, okay, just a moment. Make sure I. Sorry about that. Okay,
No problem.
I think we're good.
I think you have to go up. Yeah, we'll start with that one. Yeah, the U.S. government, when they decided to bomb Japan, they picked 3 sites. One was Hiroshima, Kamakura, and Nagasaki. And the reason they did not bomb Kamakura was because the day that they flew over it and decided to go to Nagasaki was because the city were burning coal tar, which had a lot of clouds, and also were burning petroleum. So the bombardier didn't have a good sight on Kamakura. So that's why they decided on August 9th to go to Nagasaki instead. Next slide, please. In the bombing of Hiroshima, which happened on August 6th, the pre-raid population stated between 255,000 and 280,000. And the dead from the atomic bomb that first day was between 70 and 80,000. And the injured was between 69 and 140,000 in that day of bombing. Unbeknownst to a lot of people was that there was also 12 American POWs that also died at Hiroshima. 9 died that day. 1 died 13 hours later, and 2 other died within a month. And they were all the Army Air Corps, and they were all shot down when their mission was to bomb ships near Japan, and they were all taken to Hiroshima and were put in jail, because in Hiroshima they did not have any POW camps located around there. Next slide. And in Nagasaki, they had a pre-raid population between 195 to 240,000 people. And the statistics read that between 35 and 40,000 died that day. And injured was about between 25 to 74,000. And they had at Nagasaki, there was 3 POW camps, 2 located in Nagasaki and 1 on an island. And this was really interesting fact, because my mother said that she was 12 when this happened, and on her way to school, she had to pass by one of the POW camps. And at that POW camp, they had British, Australian, and Dutch that were located there. Next slide. And this shows a picture of, on the left side, Hiroshima before they dropped the bomb, and on the right side was after. And if you see from this photo, it's everything was flattened. And in fact, in Hiroshima, 90% of the medical staff were either killed or injured. which caused the survivors a hard time because there was no medical people that were around to help with the wounded. Next slide. And on this picture on the top right is Nagasaki before the bombing. And on the right, lower right is Nagasaki after. What saved Nagasaki from more destruction was that Nagasaki is very hilly. In fact, the reason my mother was saved is because at that time she went out and had to babysit her niece and nephew. And where she was at was behind one of the hills that saved. But my mother did lose a older sister that was 17 and that worked at they were required to work many hours after school. And she was working at the Mitsubishi plant. And she was 70, I believe 70% burnt, and she did not survive as well. Next slide. And here shows some of the effects of the bombing. As you notice on the left was that because my mother does, when she was at the hospital, she said that there were people that the flesh was just peeling off the bones. And on the right shows the pattern of her kimono embedded into the skin as well because of the heat. Next slide. And this also shows the destruction of the bombing. The one on the far right is a shadow of the person that was standing there when the bomb went off. And in Nagasaki, my mother said that she also saw shadows of people on walls that she remembered. Next slide. Currently, the Japanese government recognized 650,000 hibakushas. And as of March of 2019, about 145,000, or a little over 145,000 are still living. And one interesting fact was that there's 165 Niju hibakushas, which means they were at Hiroshima and also at Nagasaki. So they were, they got hit with a bomb twice. And of that, the government recognized only one person from that bombing. And that was Tsutomu Yamada, who died in 2010 of stomach cancer. And he's the only one that the Japanese government, again, recognized as the double hibakusha. And so going back to the effects of the bombing was that right after the bomb exploded, you had a lot of hair loss, bleeding in the gums, lost energy, and purple spots and high fevers. And the hibakusha and their children were and still are discriminated against. In fact, after the bomb hit, the rumors that were spread was that their effect from the atomic bomb was contagious. That if you were near a survivor, you can also get the radiation that they had. And what didn't help the survivors was that the Japanese government in August of 23rd of 1945 wrote that it was an evil spirit that followed the survivors. And the survivors of the atomic bomb, they were not allowed in the public baths, they were had a lot of job opportunities taken away from them. And their children that have scars as well were taunted in school, made fun of. And in fact, that they thought that if two survivors married, that their children would be deformed. And what was interesting was that one American POW was a Hibakusha. And his story was interesting because he was a Navajo Indian from New Mexico. And he was with the, I believe it was with the New Mexico Coast Artillery. And he was in the Philippines. And when the Philippines, when they surrendered, he was beaten up by the Japanese because they thought he was Japanese American. And they considered him a traitor. And they didn't believe that he was Navajo Indian. And he survived the Bataan Death March. He also survived the death ships that took him to Japan. And when he was in Nagasaki, when the bomb fell, he was in a cell that was built out of cement. So he survived in that case. And in the camps in Nagasaki, they had several other, they had the Dutch, the British, and Australian. And they had between 400 to 800 prisoners of war that worked at the Mitsubishi factory and also at the coal plant that was in Nagasaki. And of that, there was only 152 Dutch that survived, 19 British, and 24 Australians that survived the bombing as well. And in fact, in 1980, one of the, going back to the American POW, his name was Joe Kiyomiya. And when he was also in the prison camp, he convinced that he was Navajo, and they had him try to break the Navajo code that the Marines had. And he finally convinced the Japanese military that it was all gibberish to him, because even though he knew the language, he did not know the code that they were using. And he died in February 1977 at the age of 77. And an entrance topic was that on Yamaguchi, when he was in Hiroshima, he was also with two other of his co-workers by Akira Iwanaga and Kunishoshi Sato. And the way they got out of Hiroshima to Nagasaki was by train. And on August 9th, he went to work that morning, and he was talking to a supervisor that did not believe him that one bomb could do so much destruction at Hiroshima. And that was the same time he was talking to the supervisor when the windows blew out because of the bombing of the Nagasaki. And of the 165 Niju Hibakusha, the government only recognized two people, one formally and one non-formally. And what made it so difficult for the Hibakusha was that when the process to get that was so difficult. And there was one, I believe, Australian POW that received it in 1980. And another Australian received it in 2013, and he passed away in 2014. And what that meant was that if you were considered a hibakusha by the government, you were given $6,200 and between $200 and $300 per month. And every 2 years, you were allowed to go to Japan for a full free medical checkup. And on the discrimination part of the hibakusha was that right after MacArthur came to Japan, he censored everything about the bombing, because they had a Japanese photographer that went to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and they took pictures of what happened, and they were all confiscated. And it wasn't until 1952 that the censorship was vacated. And in 1957, the atomic bomb victim medical care law allowed some benefits to be given to the survivors. But again, that also, and it was only given to the people that were there the day of the bombing. And that was hard to achieve as well, because the government made it so difficult to obtain the information to provide to them. Then in 1995, the Hibakusha relief law was passed. But again, it was hard to understand that as well. But they made it where if you were there that day or visited that site within 2 weeks, you were considered a Hibakusha survivor. And the US was kept in the dark as well when it came to the effects of the bombing and the effects that the radiation had on the survivors as well. Until 1955, when 25 women from Hiroshima that were dubbed the Hiroshima Maidens came to New York to have surgery done to their faces. Because at that time, the US surgeons were more adept at reconstruction than the Japanese were. And because of that, that made a lot of people here in the US aware of what was going on. Next. Next slide, please. This is a picture of the Hiroshima Peace Park. And they had a gentleman that was a survivor of the Peace Park. And it took him 40 years, because at the Peace Park, they have in memorial, just like the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, all the names of the people that perished because of the bombing in Hiroshima. And it took a gentleman 40 years to also add the 12 Americans that perished in the bombing of Hiroshima. And in fact, when President Obama visited him in May of, or visit Hiroshima, and he was the first president to ever visit Hiroshima in 2016, he also met the gentleman by the name of, I don't have the name written down, but he also met the gentleman that made the effort of getting the government to put down the 12 names of the airmen that also perished. So if you go to Hiroshima, you'll see the memorial, and the 12 American names will be on it. Next slide. And this is the Children's Peace Monument that's located there as well. And as you see, it's a monument to for peace to commemorate Sadako Sasaki. She was one of the children that perished in Hiroshima. Next slide. And there she is holding the crane, wire crane. And the folklore is, if you fold 1,000 cranes, your wish will come true. And she was the one that started doing that, but she perished before she could do 1,000 cranes. Next slide. And this is on the other side of the statue. Next slide. And next slide.
Is this the marble slab inscription?
Yes, yes. It's this is our cry. This is our prayer. Let us have peace in the world.
It is, okay.
Next slide. And this is the Nagasaki Peace Memorial. I had the opportunity to visit that Peace Memorial when my mom was, in fact, we visited it 10 years ago this year. Next slide.
Oh. All right.
Looks like that's the same picture that we had before.
Okay, I think there's a delay here.
I think we need the one right above that one.
All right. There seems to be a delay.
Should be number 17.
Mhm. Is it not appearing?
No, no.
What I can do is stop sharing and then,
But I have it right here. On the Nagasaki Peace Memorial, it's a 10-meter tall peace statue created by sculptor Selbo Kitamura of Nagasaki Prefecture. The statue's right hand points to the threat of nuclear weapons, while the extended left hand symbolizes external peace. The mild face symbolizes divine grace, and the gentle closed eyes after prayer for the repose of the bomb victims' souls. The folded right leg and the extended left arm, leg slightly both meditation and the initiative to stand up and rescue the people of the world. And one thing going back to the bombing of Nagasaki was that when that happened, only 30% of the medical personnel were killed or injured compared to the 90% that happened in Hiroshima. And in fact, when the bomb was dropped, it was less than 1,000 meters, I believe, from the university hospital. And I noticed that at the Nagasaki Peace Memorial, that a lot of the other countries have also provided statues as well. You had some from the USSR, you had some from Poland, Cuba, the Netherlands. And the only thing that I saw that represented the US was a plaque that was sent for Nagasaki sister city in the US. And what a lot of children do when they come to the Peace Park, they lay the cranes on the statue, as you see here. Next slide. And one thing I'd like to leave with is, this is our cry, this is our prayer, let us have peace in the world. And that concludes my portion.
Thank you, Arly. Thank you for your presentation. We do have one question so far. It says, when did your survivor mother talk about her experience at Nagasaki? Or how did you find out? Many survivors were silent, right?
Correct. And my mother was pretty silent about that. In fact, we really didn't start discussing it until I went to college and started looking at my own Asian roots. And that's when she was telling me stories about, she said the one thing that she regrettably said to her sister, and she's never forgetting her, my mom's never forgetting herself, was that her sister loved sweet potatoes. And she wanted my mom to bring her a sweet potato. But being 12 years old and seeing all the carnage that was around her, she told her that she didn't want to come back to see her. And the next day, 2 days later, my aunt passed away.
Okay. Thank you. And here's another one. What is the origin of the word Hibakusha?
I think David would have better answer on that, because I didn't even know about Hibakusha to use that term until recently. It was always survivor on my part.
I would offer this comment. There was a sociologist at Kyoto University who in her research found that the word Hibakusha was not used immediately after the dropping of the bomb. The first appearance of the word was in early 1955 in a paper called the Chugoku Shimbun, which is one of the major newspapers in Southwest Japan. And then the term did not become legal or technically accepted until the 1955 Medical Aid Atomic Bomb Survivors Act. So it appears that the word itself means, he refers to exposure or subject to, but really exposure. Baku is Bakudan, the bomb itself. And Sha refers to people. So people exposed to the atomic bomb.
Okay. Thank you, David. Other questions? Are there other local survivors?
Well, that's an interesting fact, because several years back, my mother, they had a group of doctors that came from Japan to St. Mary's Hospital in San Francisco. And it was open to survivors and their children. And they had set up one in LA, one in San Francisco, and in Seattle. And I think there was one in Chicago as well, where they were flying the Japanese doctors in. They would do EKG, blood work, everything like that to see what was still happening. And as the years gone by, it became less and less and less, to a point where they do not, as of last year, I think they discontinue having the doctors coming from Japan because there's so few left. And I don't know how many are left in the Northern California area.
If I may add, Catherine, we're, as part of this series, we're having some artist talk. I mentioned Jerry Takigawa, and on that program is also Joe Aki Oe, who is a Hibakusha.
Correct.
I'm not sure if he's Nagasaki or Hiroshima, but he, I think he was originally slated to join David tonight, but he had a previous engagement. So, you know, I think that'll be also an opportunity to find out more about the Hibakusha.
Yes, that's on August 22nd. We'll have that conversation with the two of them. And then here's another question quickly. This one reads, I think there were Korean victims of the bomb in Hiroshima at least, and they were working as forced laborers in Japan?
Yes, I know there were in Nagasaki. Because when I went there, they said only 3,000 perished, but the Korean government says no, it's 10,000. So there's an animosity still between the Koreans and the Japanese. So when we went to the museum, they did talk about that, and also comfort women that also perished there as well from Korea. And but at the museum they said 3,000, but in my research they said between up to 10,000 Koreans were there for forced labor. I mean, if you look at the Allied POWs, they got double hit because they were in prisoners of war, and they were forced to work at the shipyards and at the coal yards or the coal mine. And in fact, I know that the Mitsubishi ship plant has put in a plaque recognizing the forced labor during World War II.
If I may,
And then,
if I may add on to that, there are some numbers that are fairly current I can share. In Hiroshima today, there are 44,836 Hibakusha. In Nagasaki, there are 25,726 Hibakusha. And in the rest of Japan, there are still 63,320. In addition, some of these people moved abroad. So in Korea today, there are reportedly 2,052 Hibakusha. You have, in terms of history, you have to remember that Japan colonized Korea in 1910. So workers came from Korea over to Japan, and they would have been at Hiroshima and Nagasaki on 6 and 9. In the US today, there are 636 Hibakusha. And then smaller numbers, but there are some in Brazil. There are 15 in Taiwan, 5 in China, 4 in Argentina, and 1 in Uruguay. As of July 2020, there are 136,682 total Hibakusha still surviving. One other quick comment too, because unless you go to the Japanese papers, English version or Japanese, or follow American broadcasters like CNN closely, you would probably not have known that 2 days ago, 3 days ago, the district court for Hiroshima Prefecture made a ruling which declared 84 plaintiffs entitled to medical benefits that Arly described because they were victims of radiation poisoning via black rain.
Okay. And you'll talk more about that in your presentation, Mr. Yamada.
We can,
The black rain. I know
a
that.
little bit, yes.
Can we take one last? Oh, yes.
I do want to recommend 2 books. One, and they're both by Takahashi Nagai, A Song for Nagasaki and The Bells of Nagasaki. He was a medical doctor in Nagasaki and who became a Christian. And he wrote these 2 books.
Okay. Thank you, Arly. There is one last question. Maybe it's a short one. Should we take it? Has the U.S. ever apologized for the bombing?
All I know is that the President Obama went to Hiroshima, but I don't know if the U.S. ever apologized. I think David.
Short answer is no.
No. Okay. Yeah. In fact, when because when the U.S. took samples of the survivors and blood tests, stuff like that, they really did not know when they were building the bombs what effect it will have on people. So they were as much in the dark as everybody else was.
Okay. Thank you. So we'll go on into the final segment, and David Yamada will talk about nuclear weapons. Let me share screen.
Do you want me to go ahead, Catherine? Start?
Yes, I just want to pull up the slides here.
Oh, okay, good.
All right. Whenever you're ready, you can go ahead.
I just want to make a quick comment in relation to Arly's. The last question we were left with, has the U.S. ever apologized? And I'll present some ideas about that, but I would start with this. There are some interesting numbers in polling surveys about how Americans feel about the use of nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And in 1945, just after the war, within weeks, 85% of the American people said that the bombing was justified. That number in 1991, according to the Detroit Free Press, went down to 63%. And in the latest Pew survey, 2015 or 2016, the number goes down a little further to 56%. So over time, there is a decline in justification. But people in Japan refer to this as the justification theory. And the US has never accepted responsibility or apologized because it prosecuted the war and used use the atomic bomb with the justification that it shortened the war and saved a lot of lives of American soldiers. And we have had that narrative presented to the American people for all these years. And so most of us understandably believe that. But the Japanese look at it from a completely different point of view. And it's important for us to see that. 64% of the people of Japan feel today that the dropping of the bombs was very unjustified. So there is a disconnect or a large bridge between Japanese attitudes and American attitudes about accepting responsibility. And because of the still more than 50% justification among Americans, it would be political suicide for any high official to acknowledge with an apology. Therefore, no apology. Okay, I think what we'll do here is now try to establish the link between the immigrants presented by Larry Oda and the segment on Hibakusha by Arly, Mica, and try to connect it somehow with nuclear weapons. Because at the heart of the story is the presence of nuclear weapons around the world, and primarily in the hands of 8 or 9 nations. Most of us know, but I need to remind us all that on August 5, a 15 kiloton weapon, enriched uranium bomb called Little Boy, was dropped at a height of 580 meters, approximately 1,800 feet, above a point central to the city of Hiroshima. And 3 days later, a 20 kiloton plutonium-239 bomb was exploded, detonated at a height at 11:02 a.m., about 1,700 feet in Nagasaki. That's Little Boy on top that you see, and Fat Boy on the bottom. Little Boy was delivered by a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay, and Fat Man was delivered by a B-29 called Boxcar. Let us, let's see, move to the next slide, please, Catherine. 8:15, time stopped in Hiroshima, because that's when the bomb was detonated. This is an artifact collected by a family that lived approximately 1 meter away, 100 meters away from ground zero in Hiroshima. And that is when the bomb was dropped at 8:15 on August 6th. Next slide. In the background, you will see the prefectural agriculture office in Hiroshima. And that is the famous A-bomb dome that was preserved as a reminder of the terrible damage that an A-bomb can do. Next slide. Picadon means a bright flash of light, and that probably was the first thing that victims of the bomb saw. a brilliant light that was so strong that you could not look at it or be blinded. And this is one of the drawings that we saw at the Hiroshima Museum, drawn by families and survivors of victims of the bomb. Next slide, please. This is a streetcar in the downtown area. You can see the A-bomb dome in the background. Nothing but fire, buildings destroyed, raging through the city, particularly in the ground zero area. Next slide, please. This is Black Rain, Kuro Ame. After the bomb exploded, elements from the bomb drifted down toward the earth, attached to the raindrops. People did not know what it was. It was contaminated by radiation, but because they needed relief from the effects of the heat, they opened their mouth, they took in the rain, and were therefore irradiated. Next slide, please. This needs no comment. Skin hung from their bodies as they walked to seek relief, jumped into rivers. Next slide, please. Arly already commented on the statue located at the Peace Park in Nagasaki. So we'll go on to the next slide. We also saw the cenotaph with the A-bombed agricultural building in the background. And this is where the peace ceremony is held annually in Hiroshima on August 6th of each year. Next slide, please. You will see here a picture of the Otagawa, the Ota River, where annually on the evening of August 6th, residents of Hiroshima hold a peace lantern ceremony. Each lantern represents a memory of a victim who was lost, and families gather there, light their lanterns, boat lanterns, and they float down the Ota River. Next slide, please. This is Ground Zero. Ground Zero is a most powerful emotional experience, even to see it graphically represented. But if you look at the center of that, that is where the bomb was detonated about 1,800 feet above the ground. And it goes out approximately to the beginning of the red zone, the end of the red zone, which is about 2 kilometers out. And then if you go to the furthest circle, concentric circle, that is about 4 kilometers out. Virtually everything in that zone was destroyed by blast or poisoned by radiation. We want to go on, I think, to the next slide. you will recognize certainly the person on the right as President Obama, and you may not recognize the person with the back to us, but that would be the Prime Minister Abe of Japan today. President Obama was the first government leader to visit the Peace Park ceremony in Hiroshima, Japan. Okay, next slide.
Okay, now the next slide is,
Is that it on the slides? I think so.
that's it. So I don't know if we're ready for that one yet.
No, no.
You take some questions.
What I want to do is talk mainly about the effects of nuclear warheads and the potential damage of using them today. Article 2.4 of the UN Charter deals with, as well as Isaiah 2.4 from the Good Book, deals with the question of the issue of converting swords into plowshares and turning spears into pruning hooks. That's the biblical reference. But Article 2.4 is dedicated to identifying the major threat to the world today. And that is measured by nuclear warheads. So I want to quickly run down what the present stockpiles are of nuclear weapons. Today, there are about 14,000 nuclear warheads. The US has stockpiled 6,185 of those 14,000. Russia has 6,490. The UK on down, France, China, have 200, 300 in that range. China has 90. Israel has 90. Pakistan has 160. India has 140. And North Korea has 30. These are stockpiled nuclear warheads. Given the threat of nuclear weapons, I'm mainly going to raise some questions about what we can do, the threat presented by nuclear weapons, and what we can do. RFK, Robert F. Kennedy, at the eulogy of his brother, President John Kennedy, said something to the effect that we can ask why and perhaps also ask why not. Why? What can we do about nuclear weapons? And why not do something like eliminate them totally? And that is the distinction between what I call a pragmatist and an idealist. In the interest of disclosure and transparency, I'm going to refer to tostadas, one of my favorite meals, tostada. Now, when we put our tostadas in the oven, Kathy, my wife, always puts hers on the left And she puts Jenna's, when she is home to share a tostada meal with us, sort of in the bottom shelf and to the left. And she always puts mine to the right. And I often asked why she does that. And in truth, I want to at least share some transparency with you about my position and the tostadas. I am a pragmatist, but I can at times be an idealist. And I kind of move between those two positions. So maybe my tostada should be placed somewhere at the center, not on the right. But I think that's going to describe the tone of my comments for the rest of this evening. We have a delivery system for nuclear weapons. We call it a triadic deterrence. It's a triad, three legs, 3 points on a triangle. One of the legs consists of, one of the points consists of ICBMs, which are Minuteman in hardened silos. A second component of that triad is air power, mainly in the form of B-52s, B-2s, the Spirit bomber, and B-11, B-21 Raider bombers. And the C component of that triad are ballistic submarines at sea, SSBNs, SSGNs, ballistic missile and guided. With this powerful triad of delivery systems, we have entered into a period of treaties to try to regulate, limit the use of nuclear weapons today. I'm not going to comment on detail, like we saved that for the question period, but we've had a series of negotiated treaties that have attempted to regulate the use of thermonuclear weapons and delivery systems based on the American triad, and other countries have similar triads, not as powerful, but similar. Perhaps the one I'd like to come back to is the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty of 1968. I'll start there. And I think it's significant because 191 nations have signed on to it, but it is largely ineffective because some countries like India, Pakistan, Israel, and Cuba have not signed on. And a country like North Korea, initially as signatory, has withdrawn from the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty. And what it does is prevent the spread of nuclear capabilities. And instead, negotiate a program to save nuclear energy solely or primarily for civilian use. Then we have SALT 1, SALT 2, 72 and 79 respectively, and then START 1 and 2, but I'll focus on New START, which is April of 2010. This has sort of a regime built in to verify the number of vehicles that can deliver nuclear warheads to virtually any point in the world. And this verification regime under New START has established a ceiling of 800 nuclear weapons for the major powers. That would be principally the Soviet Union and the United States. And the 800 delivery systems is a ceiling on the use of underground siloed missiles, ICBMs, air-delivered bomber systems, and ships in the ocean or submarine-launched ballistic missiles. This agreement expires in 2021, February, which is about 6 months away. And the big question then is, what will we do to make sure that the agreement is either extended or that nuclear weapons prohibited under or limited under the New START agreement will never be used? And that becomes a pretty complex question. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons was signed off in 2017. This was supposed to be a legally binding instrument to prohibit the development, manufacture, and use of nuclear weapons. However, only 40 states to date, only 40 nations have signed that agreement. And it is something like 20 or 25 states short of going into effect. So unless we get some more states to sign that, there will be no agreement under the prohibition of nuclear weapons. This brings me to, I think, the central issue I want to address. If only 40 states have ratified and there is no nuclear agreement to in some way regulate or limit the use of powerful nuclear weapons, which are 40 to 50 times the power of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki weapons, then what are the prospects for civilization? I'm going to briefly comment, I hope, on what is called an iron triangle strategy, and the U.S. fiscal budget for 21. We have $44.5 billion allocated to modernize our nuclear delivery systems and warheads. $44.5 billion. The defense budget is about $4.8 trillion today. But on the strictly nuclear side, the reference to the air delivery system, the ground siloed delivery system, and the sea-launched ballistic missiles is usually called an iron triangle. We we have some serious issues with where the Iron Triangle is positioning the United States in the world today. We have about $30 billion earmarked for modernizing our nuclear forces, three legs of the triangle. And I want to, I think, mention that the fiscal 2021 budget has some issues that we need to address within the next decade, no later. One of the issues is what happened to the ship called the Lucky Dragon. This was a fishing boat, which in 1954 was fishing in the area of the Bikini Atoll. And one of the ships, a Lucky Dragon, was about 200 miles away from the Bikini Atoll. But we exploded a powerful test hydrogen bomb there. And the fallout from that test unfortunately rained on the crew. I think it was a 30-person crew of the Lucky Dragon. One has died and the other remain. But the question that emerged from that was, if we continue to use these powerful weapons developed between the end of World War II and the powerful weapons today, what will be the effects? We saw some inkling of that when the nuclear power plant at Fukushima in Japan, northern Japan, burned out of control. Plants 1, 2, and 3 virtually exposed the public to harmful radiation. And the most troubling issue, I think, is that the potential damage to humans of nuclear power, whether in the form of weapons or in the form of nuclear power plants, does not really distinguish or discriminate between whether you are at war or at peace. It is still nuclear radiation. So the question I'm really concerned with and most perplexed by is the what we do now at this point in time and about nuclear weapons. And I think of it often in terms of a fairly current Broadway play where one of the actors playing Aaron Burr speaks to Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton. And the phrase that comes out from that play is, talk less, smile more. But I'm going to substitute for that, talk less, listen more. We need to listen to the truth and the violence that inheres in nuclear weapons. There's a concept which my professor often shared with me, and it is called satyagraha, which means truth, and ahimsa, which means nonviolence. And I wonder where civilization stands today in the long line of nonviolence from Thoreau to Gandhi to Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, and even today, the late John Lewis. And it makes me think of a poem, or part of a poem that was written by Albert Camus. And I'm going to share that with you and then conclude with a thought. Camus, a French citizen living in Algeria most of the time, wrote that nothing is given to man. And in that poem, he said that little can be done. Nothing is given to man, and the little that can be done is paid for with unjust death. But he said that man's greatness lies elsewhere. It lies in his ability to be stronger than his condition. And if his condition is unjust, he has only one way of overcoming it, which is to be just himself. We spend $4.8 trillion on the defense budget, and we continue to develop weapons that pose grave risks for civilization. Which is the right way to go? To continue to spend huge amounts of money, or to pursue a path of satyagraha and ahimsa, truth and nonviolence, versus the awesome, terrifying arsenal of weapons that the world has today. I wanted to just quickly address, maybe conclude by looking at time, looking at some poll data that represent opinions and attitudes about Japanese and US ties, Japan and the US. This appeared recently, December, about a year and a half ago, in the Yomiuri Shimbun and a Gallup poll. How do you view Japan-US relations? Down from 56% a year ago. How much do you trust the United States? Down 39% from 1 year ago. What about the US-Japan Security Treaty, 1952, that has provided much of a sense of security for the Asia-Pacific region? How do you feel about it? Down 67% from a year ago. Now, this is asking people in Japan about their views on the relationship with the United States. It is not moving in a very positive direction. How much confidence do you have in world leaders Pew Research. A lot of confidence, 65%. Angela Merkel. 51%, Emmanuel Macron. 48%, Narendra Modi of India. Down at 30%, Donald Trump. In making international decisions, do you think the United States takes the interest of your country, Japan, into account? 2002, a great deal, 35%. That number in 2018 is 28%. What these numbers point out should be pretty clear. The bilateral relationship of trust that has provided security in the Asia-Pacific region is now in decline. And we don't know where this is headed. The latest is the issue in Okinawa, where half of our 54,000 troops in Japan happen to be located. We are building a new base at Henoko, which is close to Camp Schwab. And the reason for moving from the primary base at Kadena Air Base is to move from the western side, more exposed to China and North Korea, to the eastern side. There's great sensitivity in this issue. And what we choose to do will have a great impact, I believe, on whether we are willing to defend militarily the interests of our longtime ally, Japan. That alliance is not likely to go away in the next 10 years, but it tells you that attitudes and the political military situation in Asia is changing. And while Japan at the government level still feels extra sensitive to the presence and old war memories of China and North Korea, they are also beginning to give second thoughts to the traditional alliance with the United States. So things are in flux. Things are in rapid change in the world, as we know. The last comment I would quickly make so we can have questions is that our triad largely depends on nuclear weapons. And the entire operation of nuclear weapons is bundled up into a complex of about 6 or 7 high security laboratories and plants. That complex consists of Sandia in Albuquerque, Los Alamos in Los Alamos, New Mexico, Lawrence at Livermore, California. We have a Pantex plant in Amarillo, Texas, a Kansas City plant in Missouri, Kansas City, of course. We have the Savannah Riverside at Aiken, South Carolina, and we have a Y-12 National Security Complex at Oak Ridge, Tennessee. We have a lot of employees involved here. We have a complex involved here. We have a triad of air power, siloed ground power, and sea power. And what this sums up to is a position for defending the interests of the United States by use of triadic deterrence. And whether this deterrent capability increases the risk of war, global nuclear war, or decreases and minimizes the use of nuclear weapons. With China building up, modernizing its weapons capability, and with Russia, again, the primary second nuclear power today, it seems to me that we stand at a point in time in history when we have to give these issues some powerful thought. Catherine, maybe we should open to questions.
Okay, thank you, David. Let me just open the chat here. Has the U.S. ever, we've done that one, the apology. So what can be done to help pave the way to a nuclear-free world?
In Japan, I can speak for one public set of opinions. The hope is not very high. To be realistic, again, this is such a fragile time in which we live. And the capability, as I said, the weapons we have on just one submarine launched missile, cruise missile, is somewhere in the range of 800 kilotons to 1 megaton, which would be 80 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. And we have a limit on the number of those silos and warheads. I think it is today 12 silos, or maybe possibly 12 silos per SLBM, submarine launched. The possibility of accidental war is higher than ever. The use of artificial intelligence, in my view, increases, not decreases, the risk of war. So I'm not as sanguine, I'm not as hopeful as maybe the position of my tostada in the oven is correct. It's somewhere at the middle, because I am less sanguine about the prospects of peace for future generations.
Thank you, David. Here's one more, and then we'll wrap up. We're coming up to just the end here. Could the military refuse to execute commands to launch the nuclear weapons? There's one question.
Maybe any of us, Arly or Larry, have both had military experience. I was sort of a grunt GI at Fort Ord. So the question, does anyone want to address it?
You know, I think Arly is probably the most qualified. I'm like you, David. I was, a seaman on an aircraft carrier, so I wasn't in that capacity. I don't know. We can guess, but I think Arly, was probably closer to those that kind of situation than myself anyway.
Arly, go.
Yeah, on that aspect, you're you're supposed to follow orders as long as you feel that it's unlawful. Yeah, so human nature comes into effect on that.
Mhm.
So, that one's up in the air, to be honest with you.
Can only hope that they would make the right call. So, well, thank you, Larry Oda, Arlington, Mica, and David Yamada. I just want to share one last slide here. And these are things that you can do. Call on the state government, call on all state governments to conclude a treaty to ban and eliminate nuclear weapons. And you can sign the Hibakusha appeal through September 2020. Here's the website. Ask your mayor to sign the petition calling for all states to support the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And you can go to the Mayors for Peace organization website for that. We actually have Carmel, Pacific Grove, Monterey, and Marina are members of Mayors for Peace, and hopefully Seaside will come on board. And then lastly, you'll find more local and national actions at the 75th anniversary working group, the Hiroshima and Nagasaki 75.org. And then I just encourage you to register for more of our live stream events each Saturday through August. And you can go to tinyurl.com, aug-2020-remembrance. And then lastly, I want to thank our speakers. I want to thank all of you for attending. Apologies if we didn't get to your questions. This is a project, this whole series is a project of Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, Monterey County Branch. And this tonight's event and all of the events in the series were organized and co-sponsored by Japanese American Citizens League of Monterey Peninsula, Monterey Peace and Justice Center, Monterey Peninsula Friends Meeting, the Quakers, National Coalition Building Institute, Monterey County, Peace Coalition of Monterey County, Veterans for Peace, Chapter 46, Whites for Racial Equity, and again, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you to our speakers.
Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you,
to
Catherine.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye.